In this video, I want to go over some different function environments. What I mean is you can have a function that's defined inside the step it's used, or you can have it defined as a step in itself within the query, or you can have a function that's defined outside of the query, meaning it's its own query. And they have different benefits and downsides, which I want to discuss. I have a basic table here with two salespeople with incrementing sales, just because it's easy to understand. What I want is to summarize the sales for these two people, and I want to sum the sales, but only if the sale is over a certain threshold, meaning I only want to sum large sales. So for instance, only sales that are equal to or greater than 8. So for Denji, that would be these 5 rows, and for Asa, it would be all of them. This could be useful if you want to group your salespeople, or if you want to group your customers to maybe focus only on the large customers. In a no function solution, I simply have to do it manually every single step. I'll start out by doing a grouping because I only want one row per unique person, meaning I want to group based on person, and I don't want to count all the rows. I want to have access to the sales column and then manipulate it afterwards. So I'll start out by saying that the operation is all rows, which will give me then a window into the original table where it has been filtered on the specific salesperson. But I don't want both columns because I only need the sales column. Because the person column is unique, I only have one value. I'll copy this code and then manipulate it. I don't want to return the entire table after it's been filtered on my selected person, which is what the code is currently saying. I don't want everything, I only want specifically the sales column. And I can figure out what that's called by simply clicking to the right here and see it's called sales. And right now I'll keep the underscore, but I'll show that you don't need it. This is now a list instead of a table because it only refers to one column, which means that this code is actually wrong because that's doing a typing. So in this step, if I were to expand the table, it would say that the person column is of type nullable text and sales column is of type nullable number, but I don't need that. And you can see that the column header now updated because here it says it's a type table and now it's type any. I now have a list I can manipulate, which is what I want to do in a new column. I could transform this column, but I think that could be confusing. I'll also change the name of the column header. I'll add a new column where I want to first loop through my list and filter it, and then on the filtered list, I want to sum. Start out with list select, and now it's being cheeky. List select, and what is my list? That is the sales column, which I can click on, and my condition is then a function, which means I want to use the each keyword to say that for each row, or rather for each item in my list, I want to apply this function, and if that function returns true, I want to keep the item. The item, which is then the underscore in this case, because I'm evaluating each item, if the current item is greater than or equal to 8, I want to keep it, and this will then return either true or false. This then gives me the filtered list, which Asa only has sales that are equal to 8 or greater. That list is then the same as the first list. But like I said, I don't actually want to only select them. I want to do a sum of the resulting list. But I find it easier to visualize each step one at a time. Now it is a bit confusing to have 3 parentheses at the end. I think we'll manage. And then because this is a new column, I want to add typing as well, which I can do before the last parentheses. I want this to be type currency. I think I don't have to write the word type here. Yeah, this is then the no function solution, but without variables. But I can add a variable because maybe you don't want this hard coded, and maybe you want a column header that updates based on your selection criteria. So this would be specifically sum of sales above 8, but I can turn that into a variable. And all I have to do is before I start adding the column, I want to define my variable because this will be the same for each row. This doesn't vary based on the row. So I want to say my min value should be equal to 8 and that min val variable should be used inside this code. And I can update my column header. And here I'm making a mistake on purpose. I can add the min value. This is a mistake because min val is a number and I can't do a concatenation between text and number. So I first have to convert this into text. And now this will update whenever I update my variable. The only part I actually need to change is right here with my selection criteria, where I can change that to min val. And nothing happened because I'm making the same selection. So I can change this to 10, which will impact both persons. That will be the no function solution, which is okay to do, especially when it's such a simple function, but you might want to reuse the code or do something fancier. So I will repeat this. I'm just going to duplicate that for ease. And I'll do a solution that I would call a local inner query because I'm not actually creating a function so much as I'm splitting this calculation into multiple steps, but I guess we can consider it a function. I still want this minimum value to be 8, but instead of doing the calculation like so in one step, I want to split that into multiple parts. And I'll do that by, like I do up here, using let in. I'll create a query within my step saying that let step 1 be equal to my list select. And now I need to mind my parentheses, which makes me worry a bit. In the first step, like I did before, I am inside the each keyword, which means that I am iterating over my rows, which means right now sales refers to the current row. So step 1 is to go into this row, this column sales, and select only those items from the list that are equal to or greater than my value. We already did this, so there's nothing new here. Then I'll add a comma and add a new step, step 2, where I want to do the list of sum and sum the result from step 1. And I like copying the values because then I know I don't have a spelling mistake. Then it's important that I say, well, what is the output of this inner query? That is to spit out step 2. You can decide for yourself if it makes sense to have line breaks here. And then since I did everything right, it updates. This solution is the same output as not making an inner query. You can decide for yourself if it makes more sense. Here I have everything in one step, which can be cumbersome to read, where here it's at least split into distinct portions. But it would probably make more sense to make a proper function. I wanted to show that this is possible to do, that you don't have to make a formal function. Next up, I want to create what I call a local function, which is where I have a step inside my query that is a function I'll use later on. I'll also show a Lambda function, or what I call an inner function, because it exists inside the step that you use it. When making a function, you need to consider what arguments you need. I need to take a list, and I need the minimum value that will tell me how I should filter the list. And I'll use the creative name myList, which should be a list. And this will tell my user, well, what kind of value should I pass in. And then minval as number. Saying that minval is a number tells the user that they're allowed to use decimal points. And this function should then go towards, again, list sum. And now it's being cheeky again. And now it doesn't want to do indentation, but that's fine. Again, list sum. What do I want to sum? I want to sum list select. I want to iterate over the my list parameter. And again, I want to filter this to only include those items in the list that are equal to or greater than minval. And that is actually everything. Not a terribly confusing function. And when the user then clicks here, I should remember to name it. The user can then see, well, it's a function that takes a list as list and value as number. And I want that to spit out a number. And likewise, you could also decide to split this up like I did in the local inner query. I'm not going to do that right now, but you could decide to do that. That's how you would do it in what I call a global function. Because now it's as easy as taking this step, only sales, and then adding a new column just as before. And of course I need the hashtag quotation marks. And then I'll copy the name of this, because one of the weaknesses of this local function is that you can't go in here under add column, invoke custom function, and call it, because it doesn't exist according to Power Query. So you can't select it from here, but you can add it like normal in a new column. And that should also have the hashtag quotation marks. And then I have to pass in my arguments, which was a list and a minimum value. So that's as expected. You could also choose to add this as a Lambda function, which is simply where instead of having the function as an independent step, I can copy this and put that inside of the code. I'll start out by copying the last step, because all I have to change is what function is it calling. And then I go into the function step and copy all of this. Right above, I want to define my function before I use it. So copy that in and then say I want to let my func be equal to this query, which is then actually a function. And I want to use that in the query below, which means I can now substitute func sum a filtered list with my func. And you should definitely use more creative names, and that updates like normal. Like I did in the no function query, you could also choose to have the minval here be a variable that you define up above. That would allow the column header to be updated based on the variable, but it might be confusing for the user to read. I would generally not do a Lambda function like this, because it can be very hard to read. You could also define the function inside here. So down here, you would define the function and then use it. That would be a proper Lambda function. I think that's very hard to read, so I wouldn't do that. The last option would be to create a global function, And anytime you do that, you want to create parameters, because that means you can have a query that does all of your steps, which you then convert into a function. And that way you can update the query, which then updates the linked function. The trouble is that I need a list as one of my parameters. And when we go in here under parameters and add a new one, I can't add a list as a parameter. I can only have one value. For instance, here I would want that to be 8, which would be my minimum. But I can't add a list as a parameter. It means I have to add a list on my own. And this is just one that I'll be using in order to create the function. So I'll add a new query where I just add some values. Then I'd want to add a new query where I do my actual calculations that will then become the function, which is to take my list as a parameter and then do a list select from it. So I want to select my list, but only those values where the underscore is equal to or greater than my min. And I can't change the name of the source step just by clicking it or clicking rename, but I can do it in advanced editor. So I'll call this filtering and then make sure to change the in step as well. Then it's the list sum function as we're used to, where I want to sum the previous step, which then outputs a number. And then I can right click that and say I want to create a function based on it, which should be filter and sum list. And then that automatically creates a function for me. But what you'll see is that it only has my min as a variable, because inside of the query, it thinks that my list is an absolute reference. So it should always go into that list. And that's not what I want. I want this to be variable as well. It understands that my min should be a parameter of the function, which means that inside of the function that's been generated, it knows that my min should be a parameter here, meaning it shouldn't absolutely reference this my min parameter, which means I have to go in and manually update it. And that can make it harder to fix it in the future. I actually don't need this query now. I can delete it with no problem, because it's not like I can have them linked together. I then need to manually update this to add my list as a parameter. So my list as list, comma, my min as number. And then it's as simple as changing my list to my list. I could just change this to be a bit more, to explain more clearly what's going on. And then I can call it like normal, and I'm going to copy the name. But I actually don't have to copy it, because this is a proper function now, which means I can reference it inside of the invoke custom function button. So filter sum and list, and it knows that I need to select a column, which is then from the query itself, global function, custom.
Go home, you're drunk, you've been here too long, go home.
And apparently it is not smart enough to understand this. That's a bit unfortunate, but that's fine. We'll just fix it afterwards. And my min should be 8. Yeah, I can't explain why Power Query is being silly, and it thinks that inside of my query global function that there's a column called custom, and now it's called filter and sum list. It doesn't understand that there's a column called sales, which if I had to guess, it's because sales contains a list, and that's not what the Power Query helper here thinks it needs to do. It's just confused, but we can fix that. Because I don't want to reference the column itself. Here we have a self-reference, a cyclic reference, because the column is referencing itself, because it should be referencing the list inside of the sales column, and it's still being mad. Because it thinks it should go into the step itself. It's very confused, but fortunately we can fix it when it's confused. Yeah. So except for Power Query being very confused, this is by far the simpler option. Now you don't have this extra code that can be harder to read, but you do have extra queries where you have these parameters. And actually, I think I can delete that. I don't actually need it, and I don't need that group either. So you can decide for yourself. I actually don't need that either. That was just to help create the function. You can decide for yourself whether you think it's worthwhile to have a global function if you need that, or whether you can survive no function or a function inside of the query. I definitely prefer the local function option, as long as the function is fairly simple, as it is here. It's complicated enough to where I probably want it in a step on its own to make it easier to read, because then you're just referencing it like so. And if the function is very complicated, then I would definitely use a global function, meaning it all depends on your use case. So yep,